The wind pressed low across the plains that evening, carrying the scent of smoke and something sharper like sorrow stretched too thin. Marin kept walking, though her boots pinched her feet raw, though her throat burned from holding back every word she had not spoken since the morning. The wagon was gone, her father buried beneath stones the color of ash, and her mother's ring lost somewhere in the dust of the trail. What remained was her body, her silence, and the weight of a bargain she had not chosen. They had told her to sit still when the elders finished speaking, to bow her head and not resist. Peace, the magistrate had said, his lips curling around the word as if it were made of iron filings, bitter and cold. You will bring peace. She wanted to shout that peace did not wear her. Skin did not tremble inside her chest, did not carry calloused hands blistered from weeks of travel. But the men who signed the treaty did not look at her face. They looked at her dress, her smallness, her ability to be traded like grain. Marin was not peace. She was a payment. The lodge they led her to was low-roofed, made of hide stretched tight against poles. Its doorway hung with a flap that moved gently in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of sage and fire. Blankets had been laid across the floor, layered with pelts soft enough to sink into. It was more comfort than she had known in months, yet her body stiffened as if she had been marched into a prison. She sat on the edge of the bedding, hands folded, nails bitten down to stubs. She did not cry then. Tears, she had learned, were useless in front of those who would not meet her eyes. Outside, the drums softened, then stopped. Laughter rose, then faded into the steady hum of voices too far to understand. Marin touched her shoulder where her father's coat used to rest when he shielded her from wind. There was no coat now, only a dress she had been given at the fort, coarse and shapeless. Her own dress had been burned along with the wagon. She wondered if ashes could still remember the shape of the fabric that once held her body. The flap shifted. She did not look up at first, too afraid of what kind of man would step inside. She pictured scars, harshness, eyes sharpened by war. Instead, a figure paused near the entrance. Tall shoulders, broad hair bound back in a braid that caught the firelight. He did not move quickly. He did not even speak. He simply stood there, letting the silence breathe between them. When Marin finally glanced up, she found him watching her. Not with hunger, not with victory, but with something unreadable, steady as stone. She dropped her gaze at once, ashamed of the dirt on her skin, the cracked leather of her shoes, the tremor in her lap. I know, she whispered before she could stop herself. I know I am not what you wanted. Her throat tightened. I am not pretty. I am not. Her voice splintered into silence. He crossed the distance slowly, his steps deliberate, like a man who knew the weight of his body and did not wish to startle. Marin braced, expecting his hand on her arm, his demand the claim she had been told was inevitable. Instead, he knelt. The movement was simple, but it startled her more than any touch could have. He bent on one knee before her head lowered and reached for the laces of her right shoe. She stiffened, not understanding. His fingers worked the hardened knots until they gave the leather loosening with a sigh. He slipped the shoe free, revealing her foot blistered, swollen, filthy with dust. She pulled back instinctively, but he held it gently, not to restrain, but to steady. Then he took a cloth, dipped it in a small bowl of water by the fire, and began to wash her skin. Each stroke was careful, reverent, as if he feared breaking her. Marin watched in disbelief, her breath shallow. No one had ever washed her feet before. No one had ever touched her like she was worth cleansing. When he finished, he set the cloth aside and placed the shoe neatly by the bed. He did the same with the other, his silence unbroken, his gaze never demanding thanks. Then he stood and turned to the fire, adding wood until the flames rose steady. Marin stared at the wet prints her feet left on the ground. Something inside her chest cracked, not with pain, but with the shock of being seen in a way she could not understand. The night stretched long. She lay on one side of the pelts, listening to his breathing from where he rested a short distance away. He had laid a blanket for himself, not touching hers, not crossing the invisible line. She waited for words, for rules, for the weight of expectation, but none came. Only the rhythm of his breath, slow and steady like the earth itself. She stayed awake until the fire dimmed to coals, until her eyes burned with exhaustion. Still, she did not cry. Her tears had shifted into something else, something unformed. When dawn slid pale light through the gaps in the hide, she woke to the sound of footsteps leaving. The flap whispered shut behind him. He had not touched her. He had not demanded her name. He had only untied her shoes, washed her feet, and left her whole. Moraine sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. For the first time since the wagon burned, she felt her breath loosen, as if the world had paused long enough to let her exist without defense. The day passed slowly, the kind of slowness that presses into the bones and makes every sound louder. Murren stayed inside the lodge for most of it, not sure if she was allowed to leave or if she even wanted to. The air was warm near the fire cooler at the edges, where the hide walls shifted faintly with the wind. She traced her fingers along the seams, the places where leather cords had been pulled tight, marveling at the strength of something so simple. She thought of the wagon canvas her father had patched over and over, never holding quite as firm. Here everything seemed built to last. Everything except her. When the flap lifted again, it was not him but a girl. No older than Maren, maybe younger by a year or two. Her eyes were soft, her hair woven in a braid that swung easily down her back. She carried a folded bundle of deerskin, neatly stitched with beads along the edge. She didn't speak, just held it out, her expression gentle but steady. Maren hesitated. Do I have to wear this?" she whispered. The girl smiled faintly. No malice in it, then set the garment down beside her and slipped back out without a word. Maren sat staring at the dress for a long while, her fingers trembling above the fabric, but not touching. It smelled faintly of smoke and wild herbs. Not like home, but not like death either. She changed that afternoon, stripping away the outpost dress as if peeling off a skin that no longer fit. The deerskin dress was softer, warmer, the beads cool against her arms. When she caught sight of herself in the reflection of the water bowl, she startled. She didn't look like the girl who had walked behind her father's wagon carrying shame like a second shadow. She looked like someone new, though she didn't know if that was better or worse. He returned before dusk, a wooden bowl in his hands, steam curling from its rim. Beans, squash, herbs. Food that smelled rich and unfamiliar. Maren had not eaten since yesterday. Her stomach twisted in knots, but the scent made her mouth water. He offered it without speaking, sitting across from her as she took it. She tried not to meet his gaze, but his eyes stayed on her, calm and unwavering. Each bite she swallowed seemed heavier than the last, not from the food itself, but from the weight of being watched. Yet there was no judgment in his stare, only something like study, as though he were trying to learn a language without words. Finally, she broke. "You don't want me here, do you?" Her voice trembled, her fingers clutching the bowl. "This wasn't your choice." He didn't answer at first. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt, pulled something out, and placed it in her palm. A string of small carved stones, smooth from time and painted with faint lines. She stared down at it, her breath catching. "What is this?" she asked. His voice came low, deep like wind moving through canyon walls. "My sister wore it before her wedding. She died last winter." Maren's throat closed. "Then why give it to me? You don't even know me." He met her eyes steady. "Not yet." And then he rose, stepped outside, and left her holding a necklace that felt too sacred for her rough hands. That night, she placed the necklace on the pelts between them. She lay awake, listening again to his breathing, wondering why the space between them felt less like a prison and more like a choice. When she finally drifted into sleep, her last thought was not of loss, not of ashes, but of stones that had been carried close to someone's heart and now rested in her palm. 3 mornings later, Maren woke to the sound of women gathering outside, voices low, carrying bundles wrapped in red cloth and feathers. Her husband, she still could not bring herself to think of him, by name, was gone. The girl with the braid appeared again, this time with purpose in her eyes. She motioned for Maren to follow. Maren hesitated, then obeyed, clutching the deerskin dress around her as they stepped into the village. The air outside smelled of wood smoke and river water. Huts rose low against the ground fires. Crackled children peeked from behind baskets. Every eye followed her, but no voice spoke her name. The girl led her to a clearing by the river where the women encircled her. None spoke her language, but they didn't need to. One offered a shallow bowl of fragrant water and motioned for Maren to wash her face. Another combed through her tangled hair with careful fingers. A third painted a line of red clay down the part of her hair. Maren trembled, not with fear, but with confusion. "Why?" she whispered, though no one answered. Then they unfolded a crimson garment stitched with bone-colored thread. A ceremonial dress not meant for work or travel. Her hands shook as they helped her step into it. When they brought her back through the village, her cheeks were wet with tears she hadn't noticed falling. And at the lodge he was waiting, freshly washed, wearing new buckskin that clung to his frame like armor, his long hair tied neatly with red string. The elder stood nearby, solemn. He bowed his head once, as if to acknowledge how heavy the moment was for her. One of the elders spoke words she didn't understand, slow and rhythmic, then placed a carved staff between them. The meaning was clear: step across, and you are part of this now. Her bare feet trembled against the earth, but she stepped. His hands found hers, not tightly, not possessively, but firmly enough that she did not feel alone. The murmur of approval rose behind them. When the elder finished speaking, the villagers dispersed, leaving them in silence. That night she sat on the bed, not crying, not trembling, but uncertain. And again he knelt. Again he untied her dusty shoes, brushing dirt from her feet as though they were sacred. Maren closed her eyes, and for the first time since the fire consumed her old world, she did not feel unwanted. She felt, if not chosen, then at least seen. The days that followed unfolded like slow water over stone, shaping her, without her noticing. Maren rose each morning to the smell of smoke curling from the hearth, the low hum of voices outside, and the faint rustle of hides in the wind. Her body still carried the ache of travel and the weight of fear, but her hands began to move without trembling. She swept ash from the fire pit, rinsed blankets at the river, even stitched a small tear in the deerskin dress she now wore. The tasks were simple, but each one left her with the strange sense that she was not just waiting anymore. She was living. Nantan, the name she finally allowed herself to whisper, was gone, often leaving before dawn and returning at dusk. He never explained where he went, never gave orders, but always returned with something that showed he had thought of her. A strip of smoked meat, a carved comb, a bundle of herbs left silently by the fire. Each gift was quiet, almost careless, yet it planted something inside her chest that felt like a seed she didn't dare name. When he returned at night, he ate in silence, sitting across from her, his dark eyes steady but not sharp. Sometimes she felt as if he were waiting for her to speak first, but words were stones in her throat, heavy and reluctant. One morning, as the sun climbed pale above the ridge, an older woman entered the lodge. Tall, wrapped in layers of fabric the color of sand and stone, her hair streaked with silver. Her presence filled the space without effort. Maren froze, unsure whether to rise or bow. The woman's eyes studied her with calm, not unkind but piercing. "I am Nasha," she said in accented English, her voice neither soft nor hard. "You live with Nantan now." Maren nodded slowly. "Yes, I do." Nasha's gaze sharpened. "You eat our food, you sleep in our shelter, but you do not yet walk among us." Shame burned in Maren's cheeks because the words were true. She existed like a shadow, close but not part of anything. "I don't know what I'm allowed to do," Maren admitted, her voice small, "or who I am here." For a long moment, Nasha said nothing. Then she reached into the pouch at her waist and drew out a beaded loop, the colors earthy and warm. She held it out. "Tomorrow you sit in the circle with the women, if you want. No one will ask you to speak. But if you stay silent too long, your heart will dry." She placed the loop into Maren's hand and left without another word. Maren stared down at the beads long after the flap closed. The loop was warm from the sun, smooth under her fingers. She did not understand what the circle was, what it demanded of her, but she knew one thing. It was not an order. It was an invitation, a door. That evening when Nantan returned, he placed a fresh rabbit by the fire and sat across from her. Maren's fingers tightened around the loop. She wanted to tell him about Nasha, about the circle, about her fear and her curiosity, but instead she held up the small comb he had given her days before. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was firmer this time. "It's beautiful." He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a breath, then softened with a faint smile. "It was my mother's," he said. After a pause, "Now it's yours." Maren's throat tightened. Something flickered in her chest, sharp and tender. That night when she lay on the pelts, she did not turn away from him. She faced him in the dim firelight, whispering, "If I sit with them, will they let me belong?" His eyes remained closed, but he answered quietly, "Only if you choose to." The next morning dawned gentle, the kind of light that did not press, but invited. Maren stepped outside, clutching the beaded loop in her trembling hand. Nanton had left early, saying only North Trail. 2 days. She was alone with her choice. The village stirred around her, children chasing each other, women carrying water, old men stretching toward the sun. No one stopped her as she followed the scent of simmering maize toward the eastern edge of the village, where the women gathered beneath a low tree. They sat in a ring, cross-legged, busy, with their hands threading beads, grinding herbs, twisting fibers. Their voices rose and fell like birdsong. Maren hovered at the edge, her feet rooted in fear. She could feel them noticing her without looking up, the silence bending slightly around her presence. For a moment, she almost turned back. But then a little girl, perhaps 5, with twin braids and a grin full of fire, stood and walked over. She took Maren's hand without a word and tugged gently. The circle opened. Maren stepped in. There was no ceremony, no grand welcome, just space made for her. A spindle of thread passed into her hand, the warmth of bodies that had survived by leaning together. Maren's fingers fumbled at first, but muscle memory stirred, mending dresses, braiding her mother's hair, sewing socks by candlelight. Different motions, same care. After some time, a quiet voice came from her left. "I am Tiva," said a young woman with sharp eyes and a necklace of river stones. Maren glanced at her, whispering Maren. Tiva nodded. "Your husband is not unkind." Maren's cheeks flushed. "No, he isn't." "That helps," Tiva said simply, and returned to her work. Hours passed without measure. Laughter rose when a baby cried and was passed from hand to hand until he settled in Maren's arms. She froze, breath shallow, but the child curled against her as if he belonged there. Her hands trembled, then steadied, cradling him until he was taken back. The warmth lingered long after. When the sun leaned westward, Nasha stood and spoke. "Come again tomorrow," she said, as though it were already decided. Maren nodded, her throat aching not from silence, but from holding back tears. As she walked back to the lodge, the fabric Tiva had given her tucked under her arm, Maren realized something startling. She had gone a whole day without thinking of herself as a burden, without hearing the voice of the magistrate who called her payment. She still carried grief, still felt the sting of shame, but something had shifted. A thread had been tied, however small, between her heart and theirs. That night before sleep, she whispered into the dim lodge, "Thank you, Nantan, for leaving me long enough to find the women." She didn't know if he heard across the distance, but she felt the air exhale as if the whole place had been waiting for her to say it. The days blended into each other, but for the first time since Maren had stepped into the lodge, the blur was not born of numbness, but of small rhythms beginning to take root. She rose with the women, walked to the river with them, and sat in the circle beneath the tree. Her fingers learned the feel of fibers, the patience of threading beads, the rhythm of grinding herbs into powders that smelled sharp and earthy. She spoke little, but silence was no longer her cage. It was the fabric of the circle itself, a silence that carried meaning without words. One afternoon, Tiva pressed a piece of dyed cloth into Maren's lap. "You shouldn't wear white here," she said gently. "It frightens the little ones. They think it's a ghost." Maren looked down at her faded wedding shift, now dirt-streaked and frayed, and realized she had not thought of how she appeared through their eyes. "Thank you," she murmured. Tiva shrugged, though her mouth tilted with the hint of a smile. "You can sew." "That's good. We'll show you the rest." And they did. Maren sat longer each day, laughter echoing around her like birdsong. She touched her own hair, now combing it with the carved comb Nantan had given her, braiding it loosely like the women had taught her. Sometimes when she returned to the lodge, she found small tokens left behind. Berries in a cup, a woven shawl folded neatly on a stone, a strip of smoked fish wrapped in hide. Nantan never spoke of them, never drew attention, but each gesture landed softly inside her chest. 3 nights after her first day in the circle, she heard movement outside the lodge. A shape emerged between the trees, broad-shouldered, his braid loose from travel leather boots, dusted from the trail. Nantan. He crouched by the riverbank, filling his water pouch. Maren hesitated in the shadows, unsure if he had seen her. But when he rose, his eyes found hers. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he gave a faint nod and turned toward the path, slow enough that she could follow if she wished. Her heart pounded, but her feet carried her forward. She gathered her skirt and stepped into the woods behind him. They walked in silence. His footsteps grounded hers, light but steady now. The canopy flickered with gold-light branches weaving shadows across their faces. Marin expected the silence to ache, but it didn't. It felt full like fire that warms without crackling. Finally, she broke it. "I sat with the women," she said softly. Her voice seemed too loud in the hush of the woods. Nantan's lips curved slightly as though he tried not to smile. "Good," he said. "They have many ways to teach." Marin nodded. "They gave me another dress." He glanced at her briefly, then forward again. "You look strong in it." She laughed, surprised by the sound. "I didn't expect that word." "It's the right one," he replied simply. Their hands brushed, once accidental. Neither pulled away. The path widened, and ahead stood a wooden frame lashed with beams, a perfect square rising against the sky. Marin stopped. "For who?" she asked. Nantan's gaze remained on the structure. "For you if you stay." Her breath caught. She had no answer, not yet, but he did not press. "When the thaw comes, you will decide. If you stay, we finish the roof together. If not—" He finally looked at her, his eyes steady but not unkind. "I will finish it alone." They walked back as the sun dipped lower. A small child gathered sticks near the path, his cheeks smudged with dirt. Nantan bent to hand him a stray branch. The boy grinned, unafraid. Marin whispered, "They know you. They trust you." Nantan glanced sideways. "No one is born gentle. You learn or you don't." The words lodged deep inside her. That evening he paused at the doorway of the lodge. "I go again tomorrow." "West Trail." Marin met his eyes. "You go often. There are things to bring things to mend." She lowered her gaze, then lifted it. "But you always come back." His stare held hers for a beat longer than usual. "I do," he said. "Because you're here." Then he stepped into the night, leaving her heart thundering as if it had been struck by fire. The cold sharpened as the moon rose, slicing across the village with a cruel edge. Marin sat by the doorway, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the fire in their hearth burn too quickly, as though it too sensed unease. Whispers drifted among the women, news of the hunting party, fear left unsaid. When the last ember died, Marin stepped outside. The world was silent but expectant, the trees holding their breath. She whispered into the dark, "You said you'd come back." Then hoofbeats faint but undeniable. A shape emerged from the trees dusted with snow braid, half unraveled, a cut marking his temple. Nantan. He dismounted slowly, walking the last steps. Marin did not run. She waited until he stood before her. "You're late," she said, though her voice cracked. He nodded. "Yes," her eyes filled with tears. "You're bleeding. Only in the places that matter least." He reached into his coat and drew out a small bundle. When he unwrapped it, Marin gasped. A pair of soft deerskin shoes stitched with beaded sunbursts across the toes. "You made these?" she whispered. "Not me. My sister. I asked her to make them for a woman who walks beside me, not behind." He knelt, slipping off her worn boots, peeling away her frayed socks, and fitting the shoes gently onto her feet. The fire of shame and fear she had carried for so long cracked open into something terrifyingly warm. Nantan looked up, his voice steady. "I see you, Marin. As you are. You are not burden, not shame, not unwanted. You are the woman I would build a roof for twice." Her breath broke on a sob and a laugh at once. She stepped closer until the tips of their shoes touched. "Then let's build it," she whispered. Together. Dawn came gray and soft, the kind of morning that carried the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Marin stirred beneath the pelts, the memory of Nantan's words still burning in her chest like embers that refused to die. Outside, the village moved gently, children chasing chickens near the fires, women stooping to stir pots, men stretching their limbs before work began. For the first time since she had arrived, no one stared. No one whispered. She walked barefoot across the packed dirt and realized with a jolt that they saw her not as a stranger draped in white, not as a burden, but as Marin. Simply Marin. Nantan stood near the horses, speaking to a young boy in a voice so low it blended with the morning air. When he saw her, he didn't call out or draw attention, but he smiled quiet and deep. She walked toward him and without asking reached for the reins he held. His hand did not resist. Her fingers closed around the leather, the weight familiar, the gesture startlingly natural. For the first time, she did not feel like she was pretending. Later that day, Tiva appeared at the lodge carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "This was mine," she said, her voice carrying neither pity nor pride, only offering. "Before my daughter grew." Inside lay a dress of soft doe skin, adorned with beadwork that shimmered faintly in the light. Marin's hands trembled as she lifted it. "I can't." "It's too fine." Tiva shook her head. "It is for wearing, not hiding." Then she left, leaving Marin to smooth the fabric against her lap, her eyes wet with a gratitude she could not voice. That evening, the village gathered again, not for council or ceremony, but for celebration. Smoke rose in gentle spirals from the central fire. Children's laughter mingled with the beat of drums, women's voices weaving songs that pulsed like the heartbeat of the earth. Marin stepped into the circle, wearing Tiva's dress, each bead catching the firelight like tiny sparks. She felt exposed, but when she looked around, she saw only nods of acknowledgement, eyes that held neither suspicion nor disdain. She was no longer invisible. She was part of the flame. Nanten waited at the edge of the fire. No veil, no ring, no priest to bless their union, only the rhythm of drums and the presence of the community. When she stepped beside him, he lifted his palm open, waiting. Marin placed hers against it. No words were spoken, no promises carved in stone, yet the simple act bound her more firmly than any vow ever could. A child wound a single red thread around their wrists, tying them together with quiet solemnity. The elders watched, eyes reflecting seasons and storms, then nodded once, and the circle closed around them. Marin did not cry this time. There were no tears left to shed, only a calm so full it felt like a tide rising inside her. The shame she had carried since the night of her father's death had loosened its grip. The fear that had lived in her chest since she was handed over as a peace offering had slipped away like smoke on the wind. She was not given, she was found. The feast was simple, but rich meat roasted over the fire roots, boiled with herbs, bread baked on stones. When Nantan handed her the first piece of meat, he did it without ceremony, without declaration, but she smiled as she took it because she knew it meant she was no longer outside the circle. She was at its center. Laughter rose around her, children darted between the fires, and the stars pricked open above them, sharp and cold. Nantan sat beside her, his presence steady as the mountain ridges. "I'm glad you stayed," he said, voice low enough for only her to hear. Marin leaned into his shoulder, the warmth of his body grounding her. "So am I," she whispered. The drumbeat slowed, the song softened, but Marin no longer feared the dark. She had crossed it and found herself whole on the other side. When the fire dimmed to coals, Nantan rose and led her back to the lodge. Silence stretched between them, but it was no longer hollow. It was sacred. Inside, he knelt again, as he had on the first night. But this time, when he drew the basin of warm water toward her and lifted her foot, it was not to claim, not to cleanse shame, but to honor. His touch was deliberate, gentle, reverent. Marin's eyes stung. She reached down, cupped his face in her hands, and whispered, "I see you now." He looked up, his mouth curving with the faintest smile. "And I see you." The lodge held no applause, no witness but the fire. Yet the silence was the loudest blessing of all. From somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote howled into the night. The world spun on, indifferent and wild. But for Marin, everything had shifted. She had walked from rejection into reverence, from being traded in shame to standing in love. She had sat once alone on a wedding bed crying. Tonight she rose chosen, not because she was perfect, not because she was needed, but because she was seen, and in being seen she had become whole. The winter deepened, settling over the valley like a heavy blanket. Snow gathered on the lodge roofs, smoke spiraled slow and steady into the white sky, and the river hardened at its edges. Marin woke each morning to the bite of cold air and the warmth of the pelts beside her, sometimes finding that Nantan had already risen, sometimes discovering him still lying silent, eyes open, watching the light creep in through the seams of the hide walls. The rhythm of their days had become its own language, one of glances, gestures, and silences that carried more weight than words. She worked with the women, still her hands growing sure, as she twisted fibers into cords, stitched beads into patterns, and learned to grind herbs with measured patience. Once, when she pricked her finger, blood beading red against her skin, Tiva caught her hand and laughed softly. You bleed too, she said in a teasing murmur. Maren laughed with her, the sound surprising light as if it had been waiting for years to be freed. Nasha watched her carefully, never indulgent, never cruel, her eyes sharp like a hawk. One afternoon she pressed a strip of dyed cloth into Maren's palm. You walk more steadily now, she said. Maren flushed, unsure if it was praise or simply truth. Thank you, Nasha nodded. Strength is not shouting, it is returning every morning, even when your heart trembles. Those words clung to Maren like smoke weaving into cloth. Nantan returned less often now, journeys carrying him beyond the ridges. Each time he left, Maren felt the old fear stir in her chest. Fear of abandonment, fear of being left as she had been before. But each time he came back, sometimes late, sometimes battered, but always returning, always carrying something that spoke without words. One night he laid a fox pelt at her feet, the fur warm and soft. She touched it with reverence. You don't have to keep bringing me things, she whispered. Nantan's gaze met hers steady. I do not bring things. I bring what I can hold when I think of you. She had no reply, only a silence that felt fuller than any language she knew. As the snow thickened, Maran's steps grew surer along the beaten paths of the village. Children no longer peered at her from behind baskets. They ran to her, openly tugging her sleeves, pressing small treasures into her hands. Stones, feathers, scraps of ribbon. She found herself smiling without effort, her laughter slipping into the rhythm of the village, as though it had always been there. Once when she carried a child on her hip to the fire, she caught sight of herself reflected in a bowl of water. She hardly recognized the woman she saw, hair-braided shoulders, straight eyes lit with something not unlike belonging. Yet the fear had not vanished. One night Nantan returned long after the fire had burned down a cut at his brow and weariness in his bones. Maren rushed to meet him, words tumbling from her mouth before she could stop them. You said you would come back sooner. I thought. He raised a hand gently, not to silence, but to steady. I am here, he said simply. I told you always. He sat by the fire, his body heavy, his breath slow. Maren knelt beside him, pressing a cloth to his wound. Her hands no longer shook. Why do you go so often, she asked. His eyes closed briefly, then opened, filled with shadows. Because there are things that must be mended beyond this place, and because when I return, I remember why I leave it all. Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask if she was enough, if staying would ever mean more than surviving. But the words broke apart in her chest. Instead, she pressed the cloth firmer, and he leaned into her touch, silent but certain. The thaw came late that year. Slow drips of water carving paths in the snow, the river groaning as ice broke free. The frame Nantan had built stood still in the clearing, beams darkened by frost but unbroken. One morning he led her there, the air sharp but filled with the promise of spring. If you choose to stay, he said, we raise the roof together. If you choose to leave, I will finish it alone. Maren placed her hand on the beam, the wood rough under her fingers. She did not answer yet. The choice sat heavy in her, not a chain but a door, and she was afraid of stepping through too quickly. That night she dreamed of fire. Not the fire that had consumed her family's wagon, but a steady blaze at the center of a circle. Faces lit with warmth, drums echoing like a heartbeat. In the dream she stood beside Nantan, their hands still bound with red thread. When she woke, the dream clung to her like a promise, a reminder that belonging was not given. It was chosen step by trembling step. As the days lengthened, Maren found herself whispering into the quiet of the lodge when Nantan was gone. Not prayers, not pleas, but truths she had never dared to speak aloud. I am not ash, I am not bargain, I am not ghost. Each time the words grew steadier, weaving themselves into the fabric of her chest. When Nantan returned one evening to find her humming softly over the fire, he paused, watching her with a look she could not read. Finally, he said her name, the first time spoken fully without hesitation. Maren. Just her name, as if it were both a question and an answer. Her breath caught, and she smiled, faint but real. The silence between them glowed like coals, not loud, not demanding, but alive. The first true warmth of spring arrived with birdsong, cutting through the chill that had clung too long to the valley. Maren stepped barefoot onto the damp earth outside the lodge. The ground soft, the air filled with the scent of thawed soil and pine. Children ran past her, their laughter bright, while women carried baskets of early shoots from the riverbanks. Life had begun again, and she could feel it stirring inside her chest as if her ribs were no longer a cage, but a door opening. That morning, Nantan came to her with rope and wood, his face calm, his braid freshly tied. "Today we raise it," he said simply. Marin blinked, realizing he meant the house he had begun building in the clearing. Fear pricked her because raising the roof meant choosing, and choosing meant she could no longer hide between one life and another. "If I do," she whispered, "there is no going back." Nantan's dark eyes searched hers with quiet steadiness. There never was. She followed him to the clearing where the frame stood, waiting, weathered but strong. Men of the village gathered slowly, some carrying poles, others bundles of bark and thatch. The women came too, weaving fibers, preparing food for those who labored. To Marin's surprise, even the elders arrived, their faces lined with age but their hands ready to lift. She stood among them, her heart hammering. Then without ceremony, Nantan pressed a rope into her palms. "Pull when I say," he murmured. Together. The first beam groaned as it rose, pulled by many hands, voices calling out in rhythm. Marin tugged with all her strength, her feet sinking into the soft mud. Her back ached, her arms shook, but when the beam settled into place, a cheer went up. She laughed breathlessly, the sound echoing into the sky. For the first time since her father's wagon burned, her laughter was not a rebellion against grief, but an offering to life itself. Throughout the day they worked her hair plastered to her temples with sweat. Her hands raw, but each beam that rose felt like a vow stitched into the air. Near dusk the roof was secured, the thatch laid smoke curling already from a small fire built in the hearth they had carved at the center. Marin stood at the doorway, trembling, her chest tight. Nantan came beside her, his hand brushing hers just enough for her to feel the warmth. "This is yours," he said. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "Ours," she whispered. He nodded, once solemn, as if the word had bound him too. That night the village gathered for a small feast. Venison roasted on spits, maize steamed in woven baskets. Children danced around the fire, their shadows leaping high against the darkening sky. Nasha approached Marin, her stern eyes softened. "You pulled the rope," she said. "You did not let go." Marin bowed her head, unsure how to answer, but Nasha pressed a hand briefly to her shoulder before walking away. The gesture was small, but Marin felt it as if a crown had been laid upon her. Later, when the drums quieted, Nantan led her away from the fire back toward the house they had raised. Inside, the air was still warm from the day's labor. He placed a carved bowl on the floor, filled it with water, and without a word knelt before her. Marin froze, breath sharp. He reached for her shoes, the new ones, soft deerskin embroidered with sunbursts his sister had made, and untied them, gently slipping them from her feet. His hands were steady, reverent, as he washed away the mud and dust of the day. "You don't have to," she whispered, her throat tight. "I do," he said softly. "Not because you are weak, but because you are mine to honor." Tears burned her eyes, spilling before she could stop them. She had been given once like a burden, handed off like a payment. But now she was chosen, not for debt, not for duty, but because he saw her, truly saw her. When he looked up, his gaze steady in the flicker of firelight, she reached for his face with trembling fingers. "Nantan," she whispered, "I see you too." His hand covered hers, rough and warm. "Then we are not alone anymore," he said. The night passed, quiet, filled with the sound of the fire, breathing the river murmuring outside, and two hearts steady at last. Marin lay awake for a long time, not in fear, not in sorrow, but in awe. She thought of the circle of women, of the children's laughter, of the house raised beam by beam with her own hands. She thought of the way Nantan's silence had spoken louder than any vows, and how his kneeling had undone the years of shame she had carried like chains. By dawn, the world seemed reborn. The house stood proud, smoke curling from its roof, the fields glistening with dew. Marin stepped outside barefoot, the earth cool beneath her, and for the first time in years, she felt no urge to run. Behind her, Nantan stood in the doorway watching. She turned, met his eyes, and smiled. Not a smile of apology, not of fear, but of belonging. In the seasons to come, there would be hardship, storms, sickness, loss. But there would also be laughter, feasts, children's voices, and a fire that never went out. Marin knew this now. Survival was no longer enough. She had found something greater. She had walked into the lodge once a gift of pity and entreaty and sat alone on the wedding bed crying. But now she stood in the morning light, barefoot, seen, chosen, loved. Not because she was perfect, not because she was payment, but because she was herself. And that she realized was enough.